very fortunate to have with us the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, Eamon Gilmore, plus a distinguished panel, which I'll introduce later on. But we wanted to bring you all together, both in celebration of a campaign that we've been working on with the EU, but also to light a fire under all of us to engage further on this important issue involving internet shutdowns, which of course, in recent days, we've seen emerge yet again in an area of crisis in Iran, and I'm sure that will come up in our conversations. So it's an important topic and one that we look forward to hearing from our panel how we can take further action and be more involved in. We did earlier last year with the EU agree to work together to highlight the impact of internet shutdowns through a joint public campaign to raise awareness about the negative impact of internet shutdowns and to promote positive messages about the benefits of an open, free, and secure internet. And I'm glad to say that many of those present as panelists were also helping us with that campaign and participating. We launched it in June of last year and this year actually, and it was widely disseminated by the EU and OHCHR social media channels, including short statements by our then High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, and Special Representative Gilmore, and interviews with activists, and as I said, including Felisa, Andres, and Berhan, who are with us today. So what we've learned from the work on shutdowns is about the importance of collaborative efforts. We have with us, of course, Felicia from Keep It On Coalition, which is a major contributor in this regard. The Global Network Initiative, which Jason represents and will join us shortly, we hope, is also providing vital guidance in this area. And the Freedom Online Coalition also brings together states and has established a task force on internet shutdowns. So today, one of the focuses we wanted to hone in on is how that collaboration can be enhanced, how we can build on each other's efforts, and what are the key priority areas for our engagement going forward. But first, I'd like to turn the floor to the distinguished European Union Special Representative Eamon Gilmore, who's showed such commitment to these issues, and looking forward to hearing your remarks, Special Representative. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peggy. Good afternoon to everybody. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you on this online event, tackling the increasingly worrying topic of internet shutdowns. And it is, as you say, Peggy, an opportunity for us to look back at the past few months at our public campaign against shutdowns, which was a joint initiative by the European Union and the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And that joint initiative arose from the strategic dialogue on human rights between the European Union and the OHCHR, the first two editions of which I had the honor to co-chair with the former High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, and we identified in that strategic dialogue new technologies and their impact on human rights as being a topic at the forefront of global issues which we needed to discuss more and also to work more on. For several years, the European Union has been working at various levels to harness opportunities and to address challenges of new technologies through our action plan on human rights and democracy that we have enacted, some of which has had significant global impact, such as the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, the new legislation that we are working on, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, the work that we do through our human rights dialogues with more than 60 countries, and of course, the emergency support that we provide for human rights defenders at risk in cyberspace. Our joint campaign with the OHCHR was part of those concerted efforts aimed at human-centric new technologies, maximizing the realization of human rights for all, everywhere. Now, by no means can we claim that our campaign has halted internet shutdowns, but we have shed more light on violations of human rights stemming from the practice. We have also drawn the public's attention to the excellent OHCHR report on internet shutdowns, which was released this June, and to its key findings and recommendations. And as the report states, internet shutdowns are powerful markers of deteriorating human rights situations. Let me be clear from the very outset. Any practices curtailing access to an open and free internet is an attack on human rights. Today, across the globe, billions of people rely on the internet every day as part of their work and to access information, health services, and education, to exchange ideas, and indeed to document human rights violations. The European Union continues to advocate for an open, unfragmented, free, safe, and secure for everyone internet, and for respect for privacy offline as well as online. Internet shutdowns were rarely documented 10 years ago, but thanks to the work of independent civil society organizations such as Access Now, who are present on our panel today, we now have a better picture. The Keep It On Coalition has documented between 2016 and 2021, 931 internet shutdowns in 74 countries. Shutdowns are more prevalent in Africa and Asia, while they can vary significantly in length from a few hours to months. Internet shutdowns are on the rise across the world. Shutdowns, be they a blanket blockage of the internet, a blockage of certain websites or services, or a limitation of the bandwidth, are in the majority implemented by governments as a crackdown on freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and sometimes to manipulate democratic processes. As you have already mentioned, Peggy, as we speak, the authorities in Iran have been severely restricting internet access and cracking down on protests that erupted following the shocking death of Mahsa Amini while she was in custody of the morality police for not wearing her hijab. According to the OHCHR report, almost half of all shutdowns recorded by civil society groups between 2016 and 2021 were carried out in the context of protests and political crises, with 225 shutdowns recorded during public demonstrations. In the same period, at least 52 elections were affected by internet shutdowns. In our campaign, we have given voice to human rights defenders on the ground who are fighting to keep the internet open. We have heard and disseminated stories from Venezuela, Zambia, Myanmar, and Kazakhstan. Thousands of viewers across the globe have engaged with our internet shutdown campaign on social media. Despite the worrying trend, the picture is not all bleak. For a free digital sphere. Civil society organizations are monitoring and analyzing shutdowns. We are also seeing national and regional human rights courts investigating shutdowns. I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists the positive stories of resilience. Moreover, today's discussion is not only about taking stock of the current situation, but also about identifying what concrete actions we can take to improve our fight against shutdowns. In conclusion, let me assure you that the European Union is committed to continue condemning shutdowns in our diplomacy. We will also continue to foster connectivity, in particular to the implementation of the Global Gateway. Through our new programming cycle, we will fund specific measures to protect civil society in the digital sphere, including by financing VPNs and trainings on digital security. We will also increasingly liaise with the private sector, including through the EU's new office in San Francisco. And of course, we will continue engaging with the United Nations system and with the new High Commissioner and his office, with the UN Special Procedures and the UN Tech Envoy to combat internet shutdowns. Because the United Nations remains the essential forum where new measures and new standards in the digital sphere are discussed and developed in full compliance with international human rights law. Thank you very much, Peggy, and thank you for moderating this event.
Thank you so much, Special Representative Gilmore, both for that profound commitment that you have made and that the EU has made to raising the profile of this issue and for engaging on it in the variety of ways that you've talked about, and of course as well for your kind remarks about the role of the office and the UN in general and the report. We do hope that it has provided a touch point for some of the activities here. But as I noted earlier, we also have many to thank for what's in there. And I as you know, we'll hear from some of them later in this event. I want to now turn to a video message from the acting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Nada El-Nashif.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to address you today. The benefits of digital connectivity for human rights, democracy, and development are widely recognized. Conversely, disrupting connectivity through internet shutdowns achieves the exact opposite and deprives people of many basic services and rights. As technology becomes available to more people who increasingly rely on it, the costs of abruptly cutting access to digital communications grow. Last June, my office presented to the Human Rights Council a global overview of the impact of shutdowns on human rights around the world. Thanks to the work of different organizations, some of whom are represented in today's event, the report provides a very clear picture. Despite the global commitment expressed in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to promote connectivity and end the digital divide, shutdowns are still being imposed by governments, sometimes repeatedly and for long periods, not only violating human rights, but effectively undermining development. The Keep It On coalition recorded 931 internet shutdowns in 74 countries between 2016 and 2021. Over half of them took place during protests and moments of heightened political tensions. Shutdowns exacerbate tensions. Their devastating consequences for economic activities, access to education or health extend well beyond their actual duration. This is a clear-cut call for action. As our interlocutors and the report illustrate, it is not only possible, but urgent to step up efforts. For civil society and academics to come together to coordinate monitoring as they produce evidence that makes advocacy against shutdowns even more effective. For civil society and international actors to support telecommunication companies in challenging state orders and ensuring that the public is quickly and fully informed of disruptions. For the international development agencies supporting connectivity to join forces and pay greater attention to the risks of shutdowns when they design assistance programs and evaluate their impact. To use a growing body of jurisprudence about shutdowns in different parts of the world as an opportunity to improve accountability for disruptions. Colleagues and friends, the United Nations system, and in particular our office, are committed to learning from and contributing to all these important efforts. In fact, in his report, Our Common Agenda, the Secretary General of the United Nations describes ending shutdowns as a key goal of future global cooperation. Henceforth, we are discussing how to strengthen coordination and improve the collection of data about shutdowns globally. We're also reflecting on ways to increase coordination to prevent shutdowns ahead of periods where communication is particularly critical or sensitive, such as elections or protests. In these discussions, we shall not forget what shutdowns mean for normal people, how it feels to be literally cut off from the world. The joint campaign conducted by our office and the European Union has sought to underline the work of activists against shutdowns and shed light on some concrete stories about people who have experienced shutdowns and the impact on their work and lives. I want to underline that keeping the internet on is a common goal. I trust that our discussions today will help identify entry points for different actors to ensure that everyone benefits from unhindered access to the internet, which is critical for the realization of all human rights. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Great to hear those opening words from the acting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we'll now turn to our distinguished panel. I'll introduce them all briefly now, and then we're going to do 2 rounds of questions with them and look forward to hearing their comments on how both what is the current situation and what more can be done to address internet shutdowns. So we have with us today Felisa Antonio, who we've referred to several times now as the Keep It On campaign manager. Keep It On Campaign Coalition, I understand, is now made up of 210 organizations or more around the world who are active in this area. And as I said, we at the UN have been dependent on the work of the coalition, as have many others. We also are fortunate to have with us Andres Araperue, the executive director of Venezuela Inteligencia, which promotes civil society access to online spaces and online safety. I mentioned that we may have a technical issue regarding our third panelist. We'd hope to have with us Jason Pliemeyer, the executive director of the Global Network Initiative. We're still waiting for him to join, and we'll see if we're able to make that work technically. And then finally, we are looking forward to hearing from Burhan Tay, an independent researcher and senior advisor at the Internews Global Internet Freedom Project. So I'm going to turn to Felicia first, and really looking forward to hearing from you, Felicia, what you're seeing in terms of the specific regions and contexts that are of concern today, and also, what are some of the priorities for the Keep It On Coalition in terms of prevention with regards to internet shutdowns. Over to you, Felicia.
Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Okay, so in terms of what we are seeing, the Iran internet shutdown, which has already been mentioned several times, is currently a big issue for us, seeing authorities cracking down again on dissent and protests using internet shutdowns. And over the past few days, a number of internet shutdowns have been imposed in Iran following the protests against the death in custody of Mahsa Amini. And so this is a big concern for all of us, and we do appreciate the support we are seeing from the various international organizations that have issued statements condemning what is happening in Iran. And also, we cannot have this session without talking about the internet shutdown that is happening in Ethiopia's Tigray region. And this is around shutdowns during conflicts. And so people in the Tigray region have been cut off since November 2020. And that is almost 2 years of people being denied access to the internet and essential digital communications platforms. At the same time, 2 weeks ago, when conflict broke out at the Azerbaijan and Armenia border, authorities blocked access to TikTok, citing that the platform was being used to share sensitive information. And then these are trends we've seen last year with regards to shutdowns happening around conflict. And so in countries like Palestine or the Gaza, when Israeli airstrikes hit the Gaza Strip, we did see incidents of internet shutdowns. And since last year, we've seen various internet shutdowns happening in Myanmar as well as in Afghanistan. And then internet shutdowns during conflicts do put lives in danger and deprive people access to important information and even life-saving information, both within the conflict and outside of the conflict zones. And so these are some of the trends we are seeing. In terms of what we can do to prevent, we've seen continued dialogue with stakeholders on issues of shutdowns, looking at what the EU and the OHCHR has done over these past months, highlighting the issue of internet shutdowns. We cannot say how much this really means for the Keep It On community, because it's great to see that we are getting the support from various stakeholders with regards to this issue that has been ongoing for several years. At the same time, the use of litigation. So it's a two-way sword. So countries that have imposed, have used litigation to fight, can also use this as a strategy to dissuade other governments from shutting down the internet. And then one thing that we want to also emphasize is the fact that we need to continue to highlight countries that have not shut down the internet, because these best practices could also be an advocacy strategy for us. And then in doing this, we do have the Election Watch initiative under the Keep It On campaign, where we engage with authorities that have elections coming up. The difficulty with shutdowns is that it's difficult to predict when they are happening. And so elections, for instance, provides us an opportunity to plan ahead and to engage with the various stakeholders to prevent internet shutdowns from happening. And so that is also a tool that we've been using, and we'll continue to use that to ensure that internet shutdowns are prevented. And then we do also prepare in the event that we are not able to prevent them. We do provide various tools and resources to help people circumvent internet disruptions as and when they happen.
Great, thank you so much, Felicia. That gave us a lot of helpful information about both the situation that we're currently seeing and where, and also the types of things that can be done. I took on that last point that you made around the election side of it. You know, a lot of it can be unpredictable when a new situation arises that we didn't know would be there. But with elections looming, you know, is there more that we can do in advance of elections, given that we know from past experience that many shutdowns do occur around electoral periods? So that's something we can turn back to, I hope, later in the conversation. And I'm very glad to announce that Jason has joined us despite some problems and despite the very early hour from his time zone. So welcome to Jason as well. I'm going to turn next to Andres, who's really going to, I hope, give us a real on-the-ground perspective to some extent, a case study in terms of how some of this works in practice. We know you're connected with the networks that are calling for the end of shutdowns, and wanted to hear a bit about your experience, the experience of others in your region, and the types of collaboration that you've engaged in and found helpful with companies, regional and international organizations. Over to you, Andres.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be in this event. So in Venezuela, to put things in context, we have many interconnected phenomena going on at the same time. We have the internet shutdowns. We have pervasive blocking of the websites of independent media. That on top of a very fragile infrastructure that often leads people to don't have access to the internet in the first place, or whenever if they have access to the internet, they might just lose access for any amount of reasons. For example, I was afraid I was not going to be able to join you because I lost power early hours in the morning, and thankfully power came back before the session. And that of course also happens on top of many other human rights abuses, as you may have seen in the report of the fact-finding mission to Venezuela that happened earlier today. So in this context, it is obviously very important to have clear documentation of the events that are going on in countries like my own, but many others. Governments trying to ignore or not recognize that they are implementing internet shutdowns, internet censorship, or they're trying to implement these restrictions in ways that make it harder to identify it. So for example, they might use throttling so that the connection is there, but it's not effective. In practice, you don't have a meaningful access to the internet. So it's very important to have clear documentation with as much as technical evidence as possible. And for that, collaboration is absolutely essential to access to best practices, tools used to record this, and access to the data that is collected by other researchers or other activists in different regions. Some things are in my opinion, better collected from the ground, the perspective of the user that is actually trying to connect, and you can see how the network is behaving. But for some other things, it's better to have the data collected from abroad, so you can have a bigger picture of how many IP addresses can be accessed from outside of the country, and that gives you an indication of how much of the country is being disconnected from the internet. There are many other ways of doing this, and also sometimes the best data actually comes from the actual companies whose services are being blocked in a country, and that part might be the harder one to actually access, because I mean there are many competing interests right there. But collaboration is absolutely essential also for the advocacy and the campaigning around internet shutdowns. I've found in my experience that a quick local and international response increases the chances of an internet shutdown to be stopped before it becomes something that stays longer. Obviously, we wouldn't want an internet shutdown to happen at all, but if it's going to happen, we would love that it's stopped as soon as possible. And that quick reaction helps pressure the government while they still see that they can save face or invent an excuse about this internet shutdown. Also, it increases the political cost, political and reputational cost to the government. So they will be less inclined to try it again in the future. And that's also something that can only be accomplished with enough mass and enough weight if you have collaboration with local, international, civil society organizations. I also hope that the trend that we're seeing of more discussions at this level about internet shutdowns and related issues we'll continue to see that more at the universal and regional human rights systems, so that you can see court cases that are international or regional human rights courts in international reports at the EU-OHCHR process with specific recommendations to restrict the power and curtail that tendency some countries have to block the internet and disconnect it. Of this, because as we know, the internet is not only just for freedom of expression, freedom of information, there's so many rights interconnected, and we all exercising them all at the same time online. Everything from freedom of association to education, many cultural rights, work, all that happens online. And usually in the countries where that internet is being shut down is the country where those rights are the most vulnerable already. And they usually happen at the moments where other human rights are being violated. So hopefully we can stop this trend of increasing number of internet shutdowns before it becomes more normalized.
Great, thank you so much, Andres. And I think we're all very glad that the power came back on and you were able to join us. We'd hate to have your input silenced in that way. One point that you made that I wanted to emphasize for listeners is about sort of that integrated approach to shutdowns, that it's not just what can be done in terms of flipping the switch for a blanket shutdown, but the issues around bandwidth throttling, blocking of particular sites, particularly independent media you mentioned, but also, of course, the other ways that when governments control access to the internet as a whole through surveillance and censorship and other ways, they can actually eliminate the need for a shutdown because there's nothing on there to start with. So we need to address, when we're talking about shutdowns, that full spectrum of violations, I think. So we're going to turn next to Jason, the Executive Director of the Global Network Initiative. And in particular, Jason, we wanted to hear, how you're seeing the evolution in terms of companies' engagement since GNI became engaged on shutdowns issues. And what do you think we could to hope for more in terms of a more meaningful private sector engagement in this space? Andres brought up, for example, the issue of the fact that the companies themselves have a lot of very good data on what is happening. But I know that Ranking Digital Rights has commented on the fact that there isn't nearly the amount of transparency in terms of what the companies know as we might like to see. Also recognizing, of course, that sometimes governments are limiting the ability for that transparency as well. So really looking forward to your comments, Jason, and thanks again for making the effort to find a way to hack in and join us today.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity. This is an amazing panel and a very timely one. And I apologize for having some difficulty connecting initially, but really glad to be with you all. I think, to your questions, Peggy, I think for the private sector generally, and certainly for those companies that are members of GNI, which is a growing number of companies, but certainly still a relatively small number of the overall numbers of telecommunications companies that that find themselves in a situation where they're on the receiving ends of shutdown orders. Everything really does begin with human rights due diligence. And that's something that has been at the core of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which of course apply to all companies, not just tech companies, the GNI principles, which are specific for the ICT sector, and a lot of the great work that your colleagues on the BTech team at UN Human Rights have been doing. We've been happy to collaborate with them on that as well. So, that really, in the case of shutdowns, means first and foremost, knowing what the legal framework in the countries where companies are bidding and eventually receiving licenses to operate look like. Of course, the legal frameworks change and they're not always clear, and governments sometimes exercise powers that are either not present in the law or are arguably overbroad given what the law says. But understanding the legal framework really comes first, and understanding the situations that they could find themselves in so that they can mitigate against the kinds of pressures and demands that we see happening all over the world. Being in a country then, once you're there with equipment, with employees on the ground, or with a contractual obligation under the law through a license agreement, does sometimes restrict, as Andreas was indicating, the flexibility that companies have, either to resist demands for blocking and shutdowns, as well as how they can exercise transparency, notice to users, and all of the things that the GNI principles call on them to do. So I think there is really, for all of us, and this is of course a very difficult charge, but really we need to not take our eyes off of the legal frameworks and really continue to push, as Andres and Felicia, and folks at Keep It Now have been doing. When we do, first of all, for governments to be transparent themselves about what powers they think they have and they need, and when they choose to exercise them, to make sure that there are avenues for challenging those exercises of authority. And Keep It On has done incredible work through its partners using domestic and regional and international avenues to make those challenges happen. And then making sure that, on a case-by-case basis, companies are also allowed to be transparent with the broader community, with activists, with their users about what's happening. And so, we've been trying, and I think having some success in pushing companies to do more of that. But I think oftentimes it's frustrating for all of us working on this issue, as well as for the companies, that the governments continue to limit what they can do and what they can say. So that's really kind of where, that we have to start, and ultimately we have to end. But in the meantime, there's been a lot of, I think, innovative partnership between civil society and the private sector. As Andres was alluding to, I think, companies like Cloudflare with their radar service and others who sort of have a big picture sense of network traffic and what's happening around the world and can detect anomalies quickly and make that transparent. That's been very useful from what I understand for activists. At the local level, building trusted relationships between telecommunications companies and civil society so that they can quietly sometimes share information about things that may be coming down the pipe so civil society can prepare, or giving sort of additional insight as to what's happening in the middle of a shutdown. Those kinds of things obviously are difficult to publicize, not the kind of thing that we choose to sort of draw a lot of attention to, but I think we're seeing some more of that in certain places with certain companies. And I think, at the end of the day, this is a really intractable and difficult situation, but it is one, as you said very eloquently, Peggy, that needs to be understood in the context of broader repression against civic space and against free expression and on sort of online mediums generally, because as governments become more sophisticated and identify more and more tools that are available to them to influence the information environment, to restrict the free flow of data and communication, they will do that increasingly autonomously, right? And so we're seeing that more and more now, that governments are finding ways to go around companies, especially where the companies may resist or may provide some degree of transparency that the governments are uncomfortable with. And so that's unfortunately the future that I think we're looking at. And that will require even more collaboration, even more efforts at transparency, even more brave activists like Andres and others that are part of the Keepin network. So GNI stands ready to continue to foster collaboration in those circumstances around those issues. And we're really pleased to be part of this panel, as well as the task force on internet shutdowns that we've recently been working on together with Access Now and the US State Department's Human Rights Bureau as a part of the Freedom Online Coalition. I can talk more about that later if it would be helpful. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jason, and thanks for the work that you're doing both through GNI and the Freedom Online Coalition. And yeah, happy to hear a bit on that in the next round. I'm going to turn quickly to Burhan, and then we are going to try to come back to each of the panelists for some follow-up points and really just, your action items. Like, what would you like to see the EU and OHCHR, the sponsors of this, do more of or do differently? But in general, what's your message for those listening about what are some of the critical steps that can be taken? But before we turn to that lightning round at the end, I will ask Burhan to come in. Burhan, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and wanted to hear your views, having worked in this space for some time, looking at the impact that shutdowns have in countries in humanitarian crisis and conflict. How can we improve assistance to those affected by such shutdowns in those situations? And also, how do you think we can better sometimes work to close the space between those that are working on connectivity issues and on shutdowns? Because of course they are interrelated, although often done in different tracks. I'm really looking forward to your comments, Burhan. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Peggy, for having me. And hi, everyone. Great to see so many familiar faces here. So I don't think there's a really perfect answer for the first part of the question. How do we help people that are in conflict in a humanitarian situation? Honestly, the reality is, if people are completely disconnected, they're disconnected. There's not much we can do unless we've really organized beforehand to make sure that there is alternative source of communications, whether we've invested in satellite or other forms of communication, right? The reality is we honestly can't do much until, the authorities and the telco companies, come to their senses and reconnect people. But it doesn't mean that there isn't something that we can do in the meantime, right? What we've seen, for instance, in the Tigray conflict and other places, is that really investing in diaspora and really connecting with them is one of the ways that we can get the real stories of what is happening during a shutdown. Right. So in conflict setting, we know one of the reasons why the shutdowns happen is to really hide egregious human rights violations. So then the question becomes, how do we map human rights violations? How do we help people, save the pictures that they've taken, save the videos that they've taken in a secure manner, so that the minute the internet comes or when they cross borders, they can, potentially upload that. So that really comes back to all of us around that. In a humanitarian context, that's also the same thing. It's about sharing information, being able to connect with civil society and especially UN organizations and others that work on humanitarian space will be, I think, is going to be really key. But moving on, I think, to looking at, organizations and, international development banks, particularly that work on connectivity. We know, for instance, the World Bank, IMF, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, and many others really spend millions, if not billions, every year in connecting people and investing in telecom companies and grants to governments to make sure that they're connecting people that are not connected to the internet or improving internet connectivity in general. But what we see, there's a significant gap. There's really a lack of recognition that some of the governments we're handing out money to are actually the ones that are implementing internet shutdown. So if we look at Cameroon, if we look at Ethiopia and other places, there's no, within this development banks, there really is complete lack of recognition that this actually is happening. One credit to them actually maybe is the Myanmar report that they put out recently, and acknowledging the impact the shutdown has had on development they're not getting really the investment, the return on their money, right? So as more companies are moving into, auctioning for 5G spectrum, many of them are actually going to IFC and other places to, investors to invest in them and to give them the money to be able to bid for those things. So I think we need to really sit down and have that conversation around, there is an impact here. You can give with one hand and the government will take with the other, then you're multiplying your effort with zero, right? So I think we really need to have that conversation and, come to terms with the fact that shutdowns are a reality. What do we do about it? when we're giving out loans, it's going to be a significant conversation I'm hoping we'll be able to have in the next 1 or 2 years, if not sooner.
Great. Thank you so much for those points on both scores, and really recognizing that initial point that once a shutdown has happened, it's very hard to really help the people on the ground. But there are some things that we can do to better document, to understand what's happening, and as you said, to engage with some of those who might be able to help us to address it, including the development finance institutions. So as I said, I'm going to turn back to the panel, and looking at the clock, you each have maximum 2 minutes to respond to the second question. So really just hone in on 1 or 2 thoughts that you'd like to share with us on sort of what the next step should be from your perspective. I heard Andreas's call for the fact that quick responses can work. And in the space where, if once a government's done it, the quicker you can engage to try to get them to move back and to stop doing the shutdown is better, so that they can save face. That makes a lot of sense. So I'd love to hear more from people on, are we acting quickly enough? And if not, what more can be done? Jason, you made a lot of very important points around the transparency side, and both from governments and companies, what can be done there. And I think we've all looked a bit at the collaboration side, and obviously as a key part of Felicia's work on a day-to-day basis, and Berhan as well. We had recommended in our report the need for a collaborative mechanism to compile the information that's out there. We have great NGO information right now, but we want more company information. We want obligations from governments to give us information about what they know, and from academics, and having perhaps a more joined up collaborative effort at documentation might also help, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that too. So I'm going to just go in the same order, just for simplicity, if that's okay. So I'll turn to Felicia first. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to emphasize this joint campaign the EU and the OHCHR have run over these past months. It really makes the world see that this is not just a civil society problem, but other institutions like international organizations can play an active part. So this should be replicated and should continue to happen. I would also like to bring back the point around elections. We know how much internet shutdowns affect elections. And so as Berhan indicated, I would like to add that during conversations with governments to provide funding, we should include internet shutdowns as an indicator of free and fair elections, as well as a human rights indicator, so that this conversation is had right from the beginning of signing the contract or the discussion, so governments will take that seriously. And then, of course, we do appreciate the responses that we get from the various international community with regards to issuing statements, and this is something we should do often. It shouldn't just be one-off. We should do this as much as we can to raise awareness and to also call out the governments that are imposing these shutdowns. And then broadly to everyone that is working on internet shutdowns, especially I would speak for the Keep It On Coalition and other partners, we will continue to name and shame governments that impose internet shutdowns, and we'll also continue to keep an eye on where these shutdowns are happening, documenting them. But we do need the support of everyone that is a friend of the internet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Felicia. Those are great ideas in terms of the need for public campaigning, more work around elections, as you pointed out, and around the statements and the need for that to continue to happen from a variety of sources, and for support to the efforts that Keep It On Coalition is making. So thanks for that. Over to you, Andres. Andres, sorry, you're muted, I think. I'm a little worried we may have lost Andres briefly. So if you don't mind, Jason, I'll turn to you and come back to Andres.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully Andres can reconnect and his power has not been disconnected, or his internet. So yeah, I think that you've summarized well. I think a lot of the areas that are ripe for further work and collaboration. I do want to take the moment to really just acknowledge and appreciate the work that the EU and the OHCHR have been doing on this. As Felicia said, it really does make a difference when international institutions are calling attention to this issue and are putting it on a platform like this. And I think there's definitely more room to be done there. I think it was Andres who mentioned sort of the UPR mechanism as one where this issue can be sort of consistently and persistently raised with countries where we've seen shutdowns or we're worried about shutdowns happening. There are so many other sort of international tools that can be explored. I'll just say just briefly something about the task force on internet shutdowns that I referred to earlier, which is been set up under the auspices of the Freedom Online Coalition. We are trying to start by building sort of a pool of resources and knowledge for Freedom Online Coalition members. So these are not the countries that necessarily we're all most worried about shutting down the internet, but they are countries that have a lot of diplomatic leverage and provide a lot of assistance, as Berhan was pointing out, both for connectivity and for all kinds of other capacity building and cyber and internet related assistance, and that in and of itself is a form of leverage that I think Berhan was really smart to call out, and that can more can be done there. I think that the kind of diplomatic coordination that the FOC was set up to do to be active in ensuring that democratic countries are sort of speaking from a similar song sheet or singing from a similar song sheet at places like the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, and elsewhere, is another way that we can, through the TFIS, as we call it, the Task Force on Internet Shutdowns, hopefully bring more attention to this issue, put more pressure on those governments that are shutting networks down, elevate the voices of people who are being impacted. So we're working sort of within the FOC first, but the task force itself also has a broader membership, and so we've had Keep It On, we've had organizations like UNI that do a lot of great measurement work. We've had some companies also join the task force. So we're building sort of a community there across stakeholder groups, very much sort of intended to supplement, not replace, other incredible networks like Keep It On. And I think there's a lot of potential there. So we're excited about that and look forward to continuing to collaborate with Access Now and with OHCHR, the EU, and others on this work.
Great, thank you so much, Jason. And I think Andres is back with us, although his name says Raphael, but it looks like you. So I can jump in, please.
So I'm back. Sorry about that. Power outages ended up messing up my screen. I couldn't unmute. So on my side, I think one of the few things are that we need to emphasize the importance of both having the data with like good documentation and evidence, but at the same time, the stories about how the internet shutdowns and internet censorship and all of these restrictions affect people's life in ways that people can understand that it's not only the internet as this abstract thing, but just people's rights that are being violated because they can't access the internet, and how essential that can be in a moment of crisis or in a moment of protest or political upheaval or just any moment that people just need their access to the internet for their daily life. Another point that I think is important is we need to strengthen the documentation and the network measurements. So we have a lot of capacity in some areas, but there's some weak spots, I believe. So we need to strengthen the capacity to generate more network measurements to generate this data, this evidence with existing tools. But at the same time, there's some edges where the tooling is not right there. For example, it's harder to have massive general documentation of what's going on, for example, with throttling. So unless you're having like a lot of collaboration with the company or the services that are being throttled, it's really hard to have good data on this. So it's something that it's being developed, it's being worked on by people like UNI and others, but is something that is really important because, as I said before, governments might try to not fall into one category or make things in a way that's harder to identify or harder to pinpoint as something that's their fault. So it's important to have all of those things. And finally, as I said, I think the collaboration between NGOs, academia, researchers, private sector, and multilaterals is absolutely essential in order to maximize the impact of all of the work being done in this community.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for your technical acuity of being able to jump back in. We appreciate it. Birhan, over to you for some closing remarks.
Yeah, I think for me, it's, we've come here. This is like an important point. And I think we all need to tap ourselves in the back and say, yay, we've made it this far to an extent where the UN human rights and, the EU is engaging on this topic. And, we're fully on the same page in terms of just how the, impactful shutdowns are and how they're, they're not democratic or should be, should not continue in the way that they've been happening so far. But we continuously need to ask, what happens when the internet goes off? Because so many terrible things happen. So I think that we need to be persistent in making sure that we always ask that question so that this continues to become an issue. I think for me, the second thing is also acknowledging that, internet shutdowns do not happen in silos. They don't happen in a vacuum. They happen amongst many things in a country. So I think it's really important that we inject internet shutdowns and use them as indicators, especially as Felicia was saying, to other issues, right? They're an indicator of the fact that journalists are being targeted online. The fact that so many terrible things happen to journalists offline and online is also one indication that the internet is not the most healthiest space and can be shut down, right? So I think really injecting and making sure that internet shutdowns are actually, we can see as we're working on this, they're an indicator of a deteriorating civic space and civil society and freedom of expression and access to information, freedom of the press. So really making sure that we put internet shutdown as an agenda and we use it as an indicator. If a country doesn't shut down the internet for a whole year, that means things are improving, and we can actually empirically see that as well. So I think those two things are going to be really critical for me.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, yes, that idea of both how we deal with it directly, but then also how we see it as an indicator is a crucial point that I'm glad we came back to it, about what it shows for impact on the broad range of rights. And that's, as Jason said, through Freedom Online Coalition and other efforts, we can hopefully join up some of those stories as well. And with that, we're going to close out the panel and just have some final concluding remarks. We're hoping that Special Representative Gilmore is still with us and is able to join, just to give a few remarks here at the close of the panel, and I'll do the same. But I just want to thank all of you for the rich insights that you've delivered, and looking forward to ways that we can come back to you on many of those points. So I'm going to turn now to Special Representative Gilmore. Over to you.
Thank you, Peggy, and thanks to all of our panelists, to Andres, Felicia, Jason, and Birhan for their very, very insightful remarks. Very often at the end of discussion at events like this, I find myself almost in despair, at the challenges that we're facing. This is an occasion when I must say I feel very hopeful indeed, because I think that this is a battle that we can win and that we will win, because the closing down of the internet is a crude act by repressives, which has, first of all, it's a violation of human rights in itself, but secondly, we can always be sure that it is covering human rights violations. When they close down the internet, they're trying to hide something. When they close down the internet, they're also damaging economic activity, people's rights to health services, information, and so many other things. I think you said, Peggy, and some of the panelists echoed it, that this is essentially about collaboration. And this campaign started with collaboration between the OHCHR and the European Union, and our desire to do things concretely together. I think we're seeing from the discussions that we're having that this is a campaign and an effort which requires collaboration, not just between the multilateral organizations, but also civil society. I think the private sector as well, and indeed governments, individual governments. As far as the EU is concerned, we will continue to engage in public diplomacy on this issue. We'll continue to be in touch with human rights defenders and civil society organizations to have a clearer picture of where shutdowns happen and to liaise with partner countries. We're also building the knowledge of our European Union delegations on the ground so that they have more awareness of how shutdowns work, so that they can track what is happening, so that they can ask the appropriate questions of the authorities in the countries concerned, and so that they can advise us on what needs to be done. And we're also having that discussion with the member states. So this is work that I think we are determined to continue, and I look forward to working with all of you in this effort in the months ahead.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all your collaboration on this front. So I'll close with just a few thoughts from our side about next steps and where we go. I wanted to pick up the point Special Representative Gilmore made about what motivates internet shutdowns and ultimately what we can do to make them unsuccessful, basically, because if there's no incentive to do it, if the risks are greater than the advantages to governments, then we'll be able to really end this phenomenon. And emphasize a point that's made in our report about the fact that governments often justify them based on concerns of public safety or national security. But in fact, as Special Representative Gilmore has said, the reverse is often the case, that when the internet is shut down, what we see are increases in real risks to people's safety and security. And that's a message we really need to get out there and to convey more. And I wanted to take up the point that Andres made as well about the stories behind internet closures, the impacts on real people and their rights, and what it means when the internet is off, and how it really does disturb all aspects of life for so many people in ways that can threaten life and liberty in a variety of ways. So with that backdrop in mind about what our mission is, just to say a few final words on collaboration from our side, because we too are very committed to bringing this forward. The UN system is behind this effort as a whole, and it comes through as our Acting High Commissioner made in her remarks, the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report, where he emphasized the need for internet shutdowns to be addressed. And we are working across the UN system to really make that actionable for all of the agencies, departments, and programs within the UN. So we're looking for your ideas about how to do that better. One piece that really came through from the comments that I heard, and that I'll be following up on from an OHCHR standpoint, is the need to really bridge this conversation with other communities that are very engaged and involved in related fields. So Felicia's comments about the elections environment, how much are we interjecting this conversation sufficiently with our colleagues who work on elections organizations, and the election division of my own organization. So let's find ways to bridge that conversation. And then the point that Burhan raised, and which is covered in our report as well, around connectivity. So many of us are working to close the digital divide, a crucial task and one that we feel very much committed to. But while we're closing the digital divide, while we're providing assistance and support to connect more people globally, we need to make sure that those that are engaged in those projects are recognizing that when the internet is put on, it needs to stay on for everybody all the time in ways that doesn't allow the governments who are receiving assistance to have digital connectivity to pick and choose who gets the internet, when, and how, according to their own political needs. So we need to find a way to join up the conversation with our connectivity actors as well as part of bringing this forward. And finally, I just want to take Andreas's point around documentation. I agree fully that this is an area for optimism. Special Representative Gilmore has said there's already a lot of good information, and part of what we've been able to do in the campaign is really to bring more attention to what is already known. But as Andreas points out, there are some challenges looming as well, and we need to continually up our game, because as the type of shutdown evolves, so do the documentation challenges that we face. So we need to come together. We need to work across multilateral organizations, regional organizations, companies, governments, all of those, and of course, civil society. All of us who are committed to working to end internet shutdowns need to come together to make sure that we're doing everything we can to document what is happening and its impact on people. Once we're able to do that and take up the points that have been made about making that information public and transparent, I agree fully that this is something that we can and should bring a stop to. So I thank all of you for taking the time to join with us today in this important conversation. There are many points for us to follow up on, both on our side and I hope with each of you. I hope you've been given both some optimism and some of those insights to move forward on, and look forward to working with all of you in the future on this important issue. Take care and have a good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you may be.